This is the Global News Podcast from the BBC World Service. I'm Andrew Peach, and at 13 hours GMT on Friday the 9th of August, these are our main stories. India has imposed tight security measures for Friday prayers in Kashmir. We'll hear the mood among local people. Malaysia has filed corruption charges against current and former directors of Goldman Sachs. And
so long as you don't do something harmful to an animal, there's no reason why an animal should harm you in any way.
what happened when Romania began to bring back bison. Also in this podcast, pro-democracy protesters gather at Hong Kong's international airport, earning condemnation from the authorities. Did Aung San Suu Kyi's character change when she became her country's leader? And
it was really good fun, faster than I thought it was going to be.
A fairground ride in a cathedral, but can fun and faith coexist? First, Indian-administered Kashmir has been described in recent days as a fortress, with soldiers patrolling the streets enforcing a strict curfew. Our correspondent Yogita Lamai has managed to get into the city of Srinagar and describes how people there are coping.
Because of the atmosphere of fear and tension, it's really hard to speak to an ordinary Kashmiri person outside. So I'm now walking into one of the small lanes in a residential area of the city. I can see in front of me homes that are made of wood and red bricks. I'm hoping to ask people how their lives have been affected. In front of me now, I can actually see two women who've just popped their heads out of their windows looking at us. The situation is really bad, they tell me. The government has betrayed and humiliated us. We can't open our doors. We're locked in all day. What do we do? Another man tells me they're in shock at the moment. We don't know what will happen next. There's a lot of anger among people, he says.
Now, for many in this Muslim-majority area, normality includes Friday prayers. And even though some officials said there would be an easing of restrictions to allow worship, that's not been the case everywhere. Rahul Tandon is in New Delhi, and a couple of hours before we recorded this podcast, I asked him if these restrictions had indeed been relaxed.
They have to some extent. We heard from the head of police in Indian-administered Kashmir, Dilbag Singh, that there was going to be an easing of restrictions so that people could go to their local mosque, but they were not allowed to leave their local areas. And from what we're being able to gather from the ground, that is the case. Though the largest mosque in Srinagar, the Jamia Masjid, that appears to still have its gates shut today. Once again, the authorities very fearful. You heard there from Yogita's report some of the anger that we're beginning to get a sense of now that Kashmir has lost its status of autonomy. And I think the authorities still very fearful that if many people gather in one place together, that's going to lead to huge protests with what decision the Indian government has made here in Delhi.
The loss of communications for days now, both in terms of being able to use your mobile, being able to get TV and radio signals, connect to the internet, must be having a massive impact on people's lives.
It's having a huge impact. I mean, from what we can gather is the honest answer here, really. I mean, we're getting information from people who are going in and out of the state. There is an improvement in some of the phone lines now. You can occasionally get text messages from people with inside Indian-administered Kashmir. But the stories that we're beginning to hear now of, people who are ill. How do you call an ambulance if you have no access to a phone call? And there are people in this part of Delhi who come from the region who are desperately trying to get in touch with parents who are ill. And I think the point that you raised there raises the frustration levels when it's lifted. And the anger that already we believe exists about the Indian decision to change the status of Indian-administered Kashmir could well be compounded by the fact that for the past 5 days, people's physical movements have been restricted and their ability to communicate using all the technology that we take for granted has also been stopped as well.
Meantime, as far as I can tell, in India, elsewhere in India, Narendra Modi, the BJP, more popular than ever because they've done this.
Absolutely. I mean, I was walking into the office a short while ago and chatting to people on the way in. I didn't find a single person, it's a very anecdotal sample, who disagreed with the Prime Minister. They all said, fantastic speech last night. Why wasn't this done 70 years ago? Unpopular in the Kashmir Valley, popular across the rest of India.
Rahul Tandon with me from New Delhi. Malaysia's Attorney General has filed criminal charges against 17 current and former directors of one of the world's biggest investment banks, Goldman Sachs, over the looting of a state fund. The multi-billion-dollar corruption scandal has already seen one former prime minister ousted over his alleged role. Goldman Sachs deny any wrongdoing. Our Singapore bureau chief Maura Fogarty told me more about the charges.
Previously, the charges were only against the Goldman Sachs units, the businesses themselves. This time around, they're against the individuals, and they're criminal charges alleging that they essentially knew that the Malaysian government was going to misuse or misappropriate the funds that they were raising on their behalf. Goldman Sachs helped to raise about $6.5 billion for the Malaysian government through 3 bond sales or bond offerings back in 2012 and 2013. And the criminal charges basically alleged that they knew that the money was going to be misused.
If found guilty, what sort of punishment could the individuals be facing?
Could range anywhere from criminal fines. They're also asking for detention, but they haven't actually outlined specifically what the punishment could be.
And just put this into context for us, because this is a huge investigation into one of the biggest investment banks in the world. What else has emerged from it so far?
Well, what makes this so interesting, and especially with the involvement of Goldman Sachs, is that they made more than $500 million in fees from this Malaysian sovereign fund called 1MDB. So they're really at the center of all this. And what we know is that you already have a lead banker from Goldman Sachs who was in Southeast Asia looking after these deals, who has pleaded guilty so far in the United States on 2 charges of bribery and money laundering. So we know that already. What makes the case also really interesting is that this involved alleged embezzlement by the state sovereign fund to the tune of $4.5 billion. That's a lot of money. And essentially the scandal around 1MDB brought down the former Malaysian government in an election last year where we saw the former Prime Minister Najib Razak lose in what many thought was going to be a sure win election for him.
Maura Fogarty with me from Singapore. Guam is a small isolated island in Micronesia in the western Pacific Ocean, more than 2,000 kilometres east of the Philippines. 4/5 of its population are Roman Catholic. And considering the size of the place, there's been a very large number of allegations of sexual abuse against men connected with the Catholic Church. 220 lawsuits have been filed, so many that the Guam Diocese has filed for bankruptcy protection. Steve Reich is the lead attorney representing many of those who say they're victims. Paul Henley asked him, do these historic cases date back to a time when the Catholic Church held more power on the island?
Of course it did. And you can look at Guam as a prime example of that. It was a single institution that mattered the most in the population's lives, given the prominence of the Catholic population there. So certainly it was a huge influence years ago, maybe not as much now that these cases have come to light.
And the claims are being made against many individuals, aren't they?
They are. There are a number of different Catholic priests that were involved. Priests, in some cases, were also involved in child activities such as Boy Scouts, Catholic organizations, or the schools.
And the victims, most of whom or all of whom I think are male, claim they were abused when they were young, mostly teenagers. Many of them say they were raped.
That's correct. We do have some female victims as well, but you're correct that the majority of them are male, and the abuse runs the gamut from fondling all the way up to rape.
Many of the alleged victims confronted their alleged abusers, didn't they? And indeed, other members of the Catholic Church, they took their accusations to them. Give me some examples of the reactions when they did that.
There are several examples of the victims going to their superiors at the Catholic Church. There are not many. Most of the kids were too scared to approach anyone about what happened to them. But the few that did, they were either brushed off by other priests, or they were told by their abusers that no one would believe them, or that this was something that God was condoning. And so they were too scared or confused to report what was actually occurring. We've been doing these cases against Catholic institutions for many, many years. And so the harms that are caused go beyond just what's happening in Guam. We've seen it with abuse victims all over the country, all over the United States, and indeed the world. So the harms are devastating to the victims. Many have drug and alcohol problems that started shortly after the abuse and that continue to this day. Many have difficulties with relationships. We have had clients who have committed suicide. These are horrific damages that last a lifetime for these victims, who were just children at the time they had their first sexual experience with a trusted figure from the church.
There's often a pattern, isn't there, of self-blame among victims?
Of course, there's guilt, there's shame. They don't know who to turn to. Their parents are usually heavily invested in the church. The parents often will not believe the children, and so they are left with no one to turn to.
Steve Reich, an attorney representing people who say they were victims of sexual abuse in Guam, with Paul Henley. Rewilding is becoming increasingly popular across Europe. This is the return of marginal arable or wooded land to the wild, with all the benefits to the ecosystem that brings. Our correspondent Nick Thorpe has been to Transylvania in western Romania to witness the reintroduction of bison, a century after they were almost wiped out.
A long, low roll of thunder echoes across the Târgu Mountains in southwest Romania. Into this wide tract of largely forested, sparsely inhabited land, bison bred in nature parks in northern Europe are being reintroduced, group by group. At the end of a rough forest track, a lorry load of bison, 6 young animals, aged up to 3 years, manoeuvres into position. Then the back door is opened. Fully grown bison are the biggest land-based mammals in Europe. These young ones are barely bigger than cows, chocolate brown with ragged molting coats, big ancient heads and staring eyes. Once off the truck, standing beside a gushing mountain stream, they look bemused, uncertain of their new freedom. Then they lumber up the track into the woods. Watching them nervously are representatives of the Worldwide Fund for Nature, including Marina Druga, the project manager.
Every transport is a challenge because you don't know how the bison will behave. Some of them can be quite stubborn, they don't know the place and they need first to taste the air, the water, everything. So they are afraid to come out of the transport. This is a pilot project in Romania and actually in all Europe. We are learning a lot about how the bison are adapting to the area.
Cave paintings found in Transylvania prove that bison were native to these mountains 30,000 years ago. But records show the last one was shot by hunters in the 1780s. I asked Rob Stoneman from Rewilding Europe, the co-partner with the WWF in the project, why they're going to such trouble to bring these animals back.
Bison are a keystone species. What we mean by that is that they profoundly affect the ecosystem, the ecology of the area. So these are big animals. They graze the forest, they browse on the forest, they open the forest up. That allows loads of other wildlife to come into those spaces.
Local people were surprised at first to hear that their neighbourhood had been selected for a herd of animals they only knew from films about the Wild West. At the beginning, some bison did wander into the village and cause some damage, breaking down garden fences and trampling vegetable plots. But the ecologists worked hard to ease those teething problems, and Simona Boieru, a local farmer, says they have no problems with them now.
So long as you don't do something harmful to an animal, there's no reason why an animal should harm you in any way. And therefore, having bison around, you can very easily go and see them, admire them, they're there, but once we leave them be in the forest, they will leave us be as well.
She's also benefiting, like other farmers and guest house owners, as the animals have started to draw tourists to the area. She prepares food for some of them. The bison could help young Romanians stay in the area and reduce the rural exodus. Simona too has teenage children.
Our lands here are our home, so even if my children will go, they're leaving for a short time abroad and always coming back. We've seen a lot of tourists here and a lot of foreign tourists, and other than the extra revenue that we've made, we had interactions with different cultures, which is something really special.
That was Nick Thorpe in western Romania. This is Global News with the best stories, interviews and on-the-spot reporting from the BBC World Service. Every week you can hear a review of the week's main stories and why they matter. That's in our programme The World this week. And here's Sean Lay to tell us about the latest edition.
It's all about dramatic changes of identity. With a stroke of the legislative pen, India revokes Kashmir's autonomy. How turning meat-eaters into vegans could help save the planet. The other Mona Lisa, and why she won't stop us flocking to the Louvre. And what life of sorts is on the moon.
Thanks, Sean. That's all in The World this week. Broadcast on Saturdays and Sundays on the BBC World Service and available to download from our website at bbc.co.uk/programmes. Still to come in this edition of our own podcast.
For humankind to leave the solar system, I think the radiation problem is going to be the single biggest problem humankind ever has to solve.
So what exactly is the problem and is a solution in sight? As we record this podcast, thousands of pro-democracy activists are holding a sit-down protest at Hong Kong's international airport. At one point, demonstrators sang a song from the musical Les Miserables. At a news conference, Hong Kong's chief executive Carrie Lam struck out at the demonstrators.
A small minority of people have no stake in the society, and that's why they resort to all this violence and obstructions, causing huge damage to the economy and to the daily life of the people. So I am indeed very worried, and that's why I appeal for calmness and rationality.
Our correspondent Steve McDonnell is at the airport in Hong Kong.
Where I'm standing, there are many thousands of black-clad pro-democracy activists sitting down on the floor in the cavernous Rivals Hall of Hong Kong Airport, where they are having a peaceful sit-in. Now, every now and then they break into chants and singing, and they're also giving out leaflets to people when they arrive. So this is an attempt to spread their message to travellers from both mainland China but also all around the world. And yet the authorities here, I should add, are also allowing this protest to go ahead, partly because it's peaceful, also because they're allowing travellers to move through. They've cleared these corridors for travellers to be moving through with their bags so they can get to where the train is or to their taxi. And some have signs up as well, some of the protesters saying, look, we're really sorry for any inconveniences it's causing you, but we are nevertheless fighting for our freedom.
Is everyone expecting that over the next couple of days we'll see more protests pop up around the city and that those protests may not be as peaceful as the one you're witnessing now?
I think we're almost certain to see many more violent clashes over the weekend. There are protests planned. If recent weeks are anything to go by, they're only escalating. Protesters, especially the more hard line in the pro-democracy camp, are turning up ready for battle with the police. They have their helmets, gas masks, knee pads, arm pads, makeshift shields to try and bounce the tear gas and pepper spray back. They're also prepared to throw bricks, metal poles and other projectiles at the police, and the police are in turn responding with overwhelming force, rubber bullets, tear gas, and coming at waves of baton charges. And this city's leader, Carrie Lam, has promised many more arrests if that actually does take place.
And is it your sense that the Chinese authorities will tolerate this in the way that they have in recent weeks, or that their response might become more robust?
Well, they've definitely been warning that there's going to be a more robust response, but they really want the Hong Kong authorities to handle this themselves, because the message they've also been putting from Beijing is that the Hong Kong police and Carrie Lam's administration can handle this.
Stephen McDonnell with me from Hong Kong. There's a saying that you should never meet your heroes, perhaps because they won't live up to expectations. Ben Rhodes was one of Barack Obama's closest advisors in the White House, and he met Aung San Suu Kyi several times, including very recently during the killings and expulsions of Rohingya Muslims. He's written an essay in The Atlantic magazine in which he describes her as an icon, a person loved by human rights workers around the world, but also says she changed when she became the leader of Myanmar's government. Shaima Halil asked him to explain.
When we met in 2012, she was an opposition figure. She had only fairly recently been released from house arrest. And, she was still cloaked in the language of human rights and democracy. And she was still very much someone who was trying to be of the people. And today, the sense I get is she's cloistered in Naypyidaw, the capital city. She's trying to kind of negotiate in a backroom way changes to the constitution that will allow her to become president. And of course, she's not at all concerned about essentially the sacrifice of her moral authority, as she's been silent while this ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya has gone on. So it's been a transformation from someone being an icon and a dissident to someone being a politician making some pretty hard-headed compromises.
You know, you mentioned in the essay that when you met her in 2012, she seemed like the figure that we all wanted her to be. And I was just thinking, is it maybe that we, you, the world, the West, had just pinned so much hope onto that one person in changing everything in that one country?
Yes. And, I think we bear responsibility for that. I think the West, we built her up and we projected a lot onto her. And now we are tearing her down. And I don't think she was ever the saint that we made her out to be. And frankly, I also don't think she's necessarily as responsible for what's taken place with the Rohingya as the West pins blame on her. She doesn't have control over the military today. She's obviously had an abdication of moral leadership, which is a very consequential thing in not speaking out against this or trying to do anything to stop it. But I do think the cautionary tale here is about putting all of your hopes for a country, particularly a big and complicated country like Burma, onto the shoulders of one person, no matter how appealing that person is.
Do you think then the world was misled or chose to be misled about Aung San Suu Kyi's activism and the fact that, this kind of activism, the struggle for democratizing the country, taking it away from the military was actually a kind of a forwarding of a personal agenda, a huge ambition that she was achieving by riding a democracy wagon?
Yeah, I think part of what happened is the world also changed around her, right? And so in the 90s, when she was winning the Nobel Peace Prize, and she was writing some very powerful essays about democracy and collaboration with her husband, Michael Harris, obviously a British citizen, she was a part of this wave of democratization happening around the world. And what I found in my dealings with her, and I described these meetings with her, where she would kind of talk about democracy as almost inseparable from her personal agenda. And she wasn't wrong, because if there are democratic elections in Burma, she'd win. And if the Constitution allowed her to be president, she would be. But at the same time, I do think there was a component here where her commitment to democracy was in part about the fact that she knew that as the daughter of Aung San, the national hero, and as an incredibly charismatic and popular politician in her own right, democracy would put her in the seat of power.
What did she say about the Rohingya issue specifically when you asked her about that?
In private, she would refer to the Rohingya, which Burmese politicians generally don't in public. They deny that they're even a distinct ethnic group. And she would essentially say, of course, I want to protect their human rights, but the way to do that is to have a transition to democracy. But these ethnic cleansing operations have taken place, and she's been silent about that.
Ben Rhodes, former advisor to Barack Obama during his presidency, with Shaima Halil. Humans have been to the moon, missions are planned to the planet Mars, but we've yet to overcome some major technical hurdles. Dr. Charles Limoli, Professor of Radiation Oncology at the University of California, Irvine, has been investigating one of these. It's a phenomenon called space brain.
For many years, NASA has known that the space environment is a radioactive one. The radiation largely comes from the sun, but it also comes from everywhere, being a field of radiation from remnants of supernova called the galactic cosmic rays. And these are charged particles that are traveling very fast, have a lot of energy, and can travel through the whole of any spacecraft, obviously, and through the human body as well. So one of the things that we've done over the last, say, 5 to 6 years now is look at the impact of various types of radiation and exposure from space on the brains of rodents. And what we have found is that very low doses that, for example, astronauts would incur on a deep space mission to Mars trigger lots of persistent and perhaps permanent changes in the brain that compromise neurotransmission, the capability of individual cells to communicate, all leading to a variety of impairments in learning and memory, the emergence of anxiety behaviors that impact the capability of rodents to behave normally, so to speak. We think that this radiation exposure elevates the risk of developing what we would call mission-critical performance decrements. Are they going to forget to fly the spacecraft? Are they going to forget their loved ones? No. Are they going to perhaps make a wrong decision when encountering an unexpected situation? Yes, perhaps. And once they get back to Earth, it may elevate the risk of developing some neurodegenerative disorders as well. Our trip to Mars is going to give astronauts a total dose of about 40 centigrade or something. For humankind to leave the solar system, I think the radiation problem is going to be the single biggest problem humankind ever has to solve.
Dr. Charles Demoli of the University of California, Irvine. When we think of cathedrals, we might think of solemn prayers, weddings or funerals. We probably don't think of adults throwing themselves down a giant spiral slide. But that's what's happening at Norwich Cathedral, one of England's greatest churches, with visitors able to slide down an 18-metre helter-skelter, taking in fresh views of the historic building as they go.
Woo! Oh, it's quicker than you think, and you can see all of the cathedral. All right, here we go. Oh.
It was really good fun. Faster than I thought it was going to be.
Yeah, it was really fun. I enjoyed it.
It was quite tricky, but I tucked it all in and held on tight.
Not everyone's happy to hold on tight, though. Critics say the bright wooden structure covered in flashing lights is inappropriate in a holy setting. Cathedral bosses say otherwise and point out that the fairground ride will allow visitors to see the building from a new perspective. Head cleric Jane Hedges says despite some complaints, most people have been supportive.
Letters that have come, saying, why are you doing this? It's certainly not a gimmick. It's fun, but it is about serious, really serious matters in trying to get people to think about the meaning of life, to think about their place in the world. There are a lot of people that won't come into a cathedral because they think, this is too posh, it's not for me. We hope that people will see that actually the cathedral is here for everyone.
Jane Hedges, the Dean of Norwich Cathedral in Eastern England. Time now for news from elsewhere. Our weekly look at some of the less reported news stories from around the world. Martin Morgan from BBC Monitoring is here with me in the studio. Martin, welcome. First of all, women in Iran may be about to get the right to ride motorcycles, but it's not quite as simple as that.
No, that's often the case with women's rights in Iran, I'm afraid. There's a group of young women in Isfahan in central Iran have applied to a court to see if they're allowed to get a motorcycle driving licence, and the judge has said, yes, why not? As long as you pass your test, obviously. Now, this has made big headlines in Iran. This is a big stride forward. But it's a bit too early to celebrate because more conservative judges are saying, hang on, we're not sure about this. And they want to apply to a higher court to see if they can get the decision overturned. Why? Well, the reason they say is that Iran has quite strict dress code for both women and men. And they say when you're riding around on a motorcycle, there's a danger that it might get blown about and you'll violate the modesty laws. And this chimes with a current campaign that's going on in the country called Bad Hijab. There's been TV adverts, posters on the metro and so on, trying to combat the more relaxed attitude people have been having to wearing, the hijab covering their hair and so on. And the police have actually said that if you apply for a driving licence, your photograph mustn't show any visible tattoos. This is part of the same campaign. So maybe to a lesser extent, it also applies to men.
Let's go to Siberia next. Terrible wildfires there. President Putin has sent in the army to try and put the fires out, but he's also getting help from somewhere rather unusual.
Oh, that's right, yes. Siberia is the home of shamanism, which is a traditional religion where they worship spirits, and the Buryat people who are native to that part of the world are shamanists. And there's been a gathering of 50 shaman priests. They've come from Poland, Germany, Mongolia, all together on the island of Olkhon in the middle of Lake Baikal, which is this huge freshwater lake. The island is sacred to the shamans. They say there are about 13 major spirits there, and they've been having a drumming and chanting ritual to try to invoke rain. Now, the Russian authorities say that they think some of these fires have been set deliberately to try to hide illegal logging activity. And the rescue missions have been made worse by massive flooding. So, for most Siberians at the moment, while they're waiting for rain, all they can do is hope that the shaman's prayers will work.
All right, thank you, Martin. Martin Morgan from BBC Monitoring with this week's news from elsewhere. And that's all from us for now, but there will be an updated version of Global News to download later. And if you'd like to comment on this edition or the stories we included, we love hearing from you. Drop us an email. The address is globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. My name's Andrew Peach. Thank you for listening. And until next time, goodbye.
Music Life. Music Life.
Music Life.
Music
life.
It's about how you love music.
Is anyone listening to what I'm making?
Wow, that's so cool.
Oh, that sounds sick.
It's a really beautiful song.
You can't see me, but I'm really excited.
Speaking to musicians from across the globe.
We're in private jets and 5-star hotels and all the rock star trimmings.
You're both on the same album of mine, but you've never met.
That's so cool.
About how they make their music.
Yo, this is a banger, man.
I know I need to just give some extra energy.
Finding out all about their creative processes.
When you change things, you surprise people.
Oh, okay. People like this. We're not annoying anybody.
And getting to the bottom of why they do what they do.
When someone comes up to you and tells you how your song helped them through a time, for me, that's the most satisfying thing.
Music Life, a brand new podcast from the BBC World Service. Find the first 3 episodes now by searching for Music Life wherever you found this podcast.